Hello, dear viewers. A word before we begin, perhaps? I decided to take on this challenge once more almost immediately after I posted my original development history video, as something changed within me. I believe you can hear when Herring was born at the end of that video. And as I am creating this new work, the old documentary, Squadron 42 Forever 2 Years Away, will be unlisted. But it will still be available only via the link in the description for historical purposes. Because this time I want to do the subject justice by instead flipping my strategy from last time on its head and not allow, for the most part, the developers to speak for themselves, and I will instead put words in their mouths. No, I will to the best of my ability strive to summarize the long, arduous and tedious development history of Squadron 42 with full narration by yours truly, with interjections as fitting by the developers. I wish to reduce the running time as much as possible in comparison to my previous work by increasing the amount of information given to you to ensure that any viewer is caught up with the highs and the lows of this game's development, as we do indeed appear to be in the end game now, with the release year being 2026, allegedly. But I also find it important to say that by understanding the long development of Squadron 42, you will garner a far better understanding for the development of Star Citizen as well. Because of how these games are intertwined and how they have affected each other, it is far easier to look at Star Citizen through the lens of Squadron than vice versa. The main focus has most often been on Star Citizen, which has gotten the most publicity over the years. But over the course of this retrospective, you will see how these projects go from being, in a way, the very same game to separating into two experiences with a shared engine, universe, and resources. My goal is to stay as factual and non-biased as possible, with jokes and memes along the way, but I intend this work to potentially be something one could fall asleep to, so I promise that there are going to be no loud noises, at least by myself. If the devs start hollering, that's on them.
And then we get some drinks and I'll be there and sign things and okay.
This documentary or retrospective, call it whatever the hell you want, will, through a year-by-year basis, follow the development of Star Citizen and Squadron 42, but mostly Squadron 42, up until the current day, from the early beginnings up until the posting of this video. And my intent is to decisively catalog as much information on Squadron 42 in as digestible of a format as possible. The sources for this video will be found in a Google document which can be found in the description below. I will try to keep it neat and tidy, or maybe I'll forget about it, because you are indeed getting the whole script, not just the sources, because I'm just that nice. Lazy. If you do not wish to know more about the creator of this little project or where I stand, then you can skip to this timestamp to get into the meat of it all. As an added note before we begin with the history of the game, I'd like to introduce myself as to where I stand in regards to this project overall, so you can understand the perspective from which I view this game, or games if you count Star Citizen. I am of course Herring, and I make videos primarily about Star Citizen, Squadron 42 and other game-related topics, with some toe dippings into TV when I feel like it. I am a concierge-level backer of the Star Citizen and Squadron 42 project, meaning that I have achieved that most coveted title after having spent at least $1,000 on the game. Or games. I've backed this project for the better or worse since 2014 when I was 16 years old. And I still think that these people can pull this off, because bringing a dream into reality is not always a pretty process, but an arduous one. I just didn't think it was going to be this arduous. This of course means I have a vested interest in the success of these games, but I believe if you take a look at my previous content in regards to Star Citizen and Squadron, that I am neither a relentless fanboy nor a hater of CIG. I believe accountability is something that must be taken from both the community, which are the primary investors of the project, and An Imperium, the developers. I will never hesitate to criticize either side, and I hope that I'm very clear that I strive to be as accurate and factual as possible whilst keeping the glint in my eye and maintaining some level of humor about all this, because otherwise it has a tendency of getting rather sad, bitter, and dull. The goal of this channel is to inform people to the best of my ability, but also the most critical factor is my number one goal: to entertain you as much as possible. And I hope to do that today. Without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
And it's like, well, people don't even know.
Lay down the line. Very fast. And it wouldn't be cloud.
Another edition of the brand new reverse-to-verse line.
I'm hoping to show you a Squadron 42 mission, and we're not quite there yet, so we got very close.
16 times on the tip.
Then we get some drink.
We will not lose the system.
All right, gentlemen, fire up.
Now, I know you're all asking, when can I play it?
Sit back in your seats. This is going to be a hell of a ride.
Chris Roberts, the founder of An Imperium Games and the guiding hand of Squadron 42 and its sister game, Star Citizen, needs no introduction. Who am I kidding? Of course he does. Christopher Roberts was born on the 27th of May in 1968 in Redwood City, California, to a British father and an American mother, with a younger brother, Aaron, joining the family just 2 years later on March 3rd in 1970. This horrifying mixture of American and British would later lead to his rather peculiar manner of speaking.
Is it partners like behavior or turbulent field? And then we get some drinks, and I'll be there and sign things, and okay.
And then I migrated to the BBC microcomputer, and then went on to Commodore 64, and then on to IBM.
The Roberts would spend most of their time growing up and attending school in England, in and around Manchester. Chris would later attend school and show an affinity and interest in creating video games. And as a teenager, he developed several video games for the BBC Micro that would be of a high enough quality to be published, such as Striker's Run, Wizardor, and King Kong. But opportunity waits for no man, and Chris would later in life return to the United States in 1986, now 18, to visit his parents who were living in Austin, Texas at the time. Chris would like his stay in the United States so much that he decided to make the move there himself. The weather probably not having anything to do with it. There in Texas, due to his continued interest in video games, he'd eventually start rubbing shoulders with another titan of the gaming industry, Richard Garriott. Richard would later become one of the first private astronauts, and he would also become famous for becoming the second space traveler ever to have had a parent go to space before them. A second generation, if you will. But of course, Richard is most famous for being a highly accomplished games developer before deciding to blast himself off to space. Chris Roberts would develop the games Times of Lore in 1988 and Bad Blood in 1990 whilst working for Richard Garriott's company, Origin Systems, as a contractor, with the Times of Lore making its way to influence the later user interface for the Ultima series. However, through his work at Origin Systems, he'd soon be considered a key figure and thus become more of a permanent in-house developer, eventually landing the job as Vice President of New Technology, becoming an official employee. Origin Systems is also where the Star Citizen manufacturer Origin Jump Works would get its name from, being a nod to Chris's time there. But at Origin Systems, Chris would go on to develop something that had turned him from a respected games developer to a far more famous maverick, and one could say a bit of a titan of the gaming industry. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I am of course speaking of In 1990, Chris Roberts would go on to release the game series that to this day is considered his greatest success and perhaps his opus, Wing Commander. You take the role as a hotshot fighter pilot, Christopher Maverick Blair. Really subtle there, Chris. Fighting in a desperate decades-long war for the Terran Confederation against the Kilrathi Empire, a cat-like race that is striving to eradicate the human race from the galaxy. With you, the player, having an effect on the story per your performance that is recorded, and this is something that we will hear more of later. The games would go on from being a purely animated game experience to introducing more film-like aspects, eventually leading to 1994's Wing Commander 3, The Heart of the Tiger, which would have full motion video performances by such names as Mark Hamill, John Rhys-Davies, Malcolm McDowell, and of course, Biff Tannen, also known as Tom Wilson.
I'll bet you stay up late nights just polishing it, huh? No, as a matter of fact, I have majors who do that for me.
Boasting a budget of $4 to $5 million, which is roughly $9 million in today's Monopoly money, most of the money went towards the hiring of actors and filming over 2 hours of live-action footage, or FMVs, which stands for full motion video. This footage was directed by Chris Roberts, giving him his first taste of directing that would not be his last. Wing Commander 3 would however be worth every penny, as the game was a smash hit, making $15.9 million, or roughly $35 million in today's money, tripling their money and smashing records at the time. These games pioneered several new things, such as focusing heavily on the cinematic storytelling reminiscent of Star Wars, action-packed gameplay, and immersion for the player, which of course was no small feat for the 90s, as this was practically unheard of at the time. You as the player were left as the main character in a story that you could control, and you could destroy the bad guys yourself, not just watch Luke Skywalker do it. You got to meet interesting characters and form relationships with them. Your choices or abilities could lead to the death of your wingman if you weren't careful. You got to pick and choose who you flew with, what ship you wanted to pick, and ultimately, you pulled the trigger. Which is of course some of the reasons why they became such massive successes in the 90s. These games did not only generate massive revenue for the time, they also pioneered new gaming concepts, but also pushed PC gaming into the mainstream from the fringes. Gaming was of course at the time dominated by the console wars by such companies as Nintendo or Sega. Wing Commander 3 was of course followed by Wing Commander 4, The Price of Freedom, which made a giant leap in the production budget with $14 million in 1996, which is of course $30 million today. This massive budget that the game boasted rivaled not games at the time, but actual Hollywood movies. This was, for the time, the most expensive game production in history, which can be seen in its high-quality FMVs. It was originally intended to be released in December of 1995, but was delayed until February 8th, 1996. The game would go on to become a success critically, but would barely make back its original budget. And thus the later installment of Wing Commander, Prophecy, would scale back the budget and production costs.
The ultimate sequel to the ultimate game epic.
Going back in time for a bit, Aaron Roberts, Chris's brother, had followed in his brother's footsteps and also maintained an interest in developing games, becoming highly accomplished in his own right as the years passed. Aaron would work on the Wing Commander series with his brother and make Wing Commander Privateer in 1993, which also became a cult classic in its own right. Chris was at the time working on the game Strike Commander with no relation to the Wing Commander series. Strike Commander, of course, being famous for its use of groundbreaking 3D technology and high fidelity, and also for its unheard of number of production delays, leading to, at the time, a massive 4-year development time. The tech that the game used would of course be used in other Origin system projects, but this long development overrun is something that Chris would set a trend for, that Chris would later become notorious for. But hold on to your jump seats, for at the end of the 90s, in 1999, Wing Commander would finally make it to the big screen, with the movie named Wing Commander, which was Chris Roberts' movie directorial debut, starring such names as Freddie Prinze Jr., Matthew Lillard, and Matthew Souchet. And it would become a massive box office bomb and a total critical failure, still celebrated as one of the worst films of all time, not even in a funny way. But speaking of the funnies, people would funnily enough mostly go to see this disaster of a film because the previews had Star Wars The Phantom Menace's trailer in it. And even more funnily, if you had gotten past the previews, you were no longer eligible for a refund. So people would literally pay just to see the trailer of Star Wars and then leave. The actors would even have this to say on the matter in regards to what happened and why the movie became such a mess. I can't stand Wing Commander. I can't watch one scene of that movie. I read the script and loved it. So did my buddy Matthew Lillard. We both got the parts, we went on location, and they said, here's the new script. It was a piece of shit. In spite of the disaster that was the movie, Wing Commander is still regarded as one of the greatest game series of all time, especially from the 90s era, both for its groundbreaking visuals, storytelling, and immersion, and its use of new technologies. Through the games, the novels, the TV show, but probably not the movie, it helped to sell PC gaming to the masses, and over its lifetime the series would gross a grand total of $110 million, with the last release in the franchise being Wing Commander Arena in 2007. But for now, we must go back in time, back to 1996. When Chris Roberts finally decided that it was time for him to part ways with Origin Systems, because he wanted to found his own company with his brother Aaron and another figure we'll hear from again, Tony Zurovic. Have you seen this man? Digital Anvil was founded due to Chris Roberts' desire to have a smaller group of developers to focus on creating fewer but more high-quality games each year. They also produced visual effects for movies, but the most important factor was that Chris felt that he wanted to produce games set in his own universe to make games or movies in. Because Electronic Arts had acquired Origin Systems during the 90s and didn't care for movies, so Chris decided to move on. And then he turned around and he made the Wing Commander movie. Whoops. And this poor view and relationship with publishers would be something that'd be a theme in the story of Chris Roberts. Digital Anvil developed such games as Starlancer, which was worked on alongside Warthog Studios. Starlancer, however, was mostly managed by Aaron Roberts instead of Chris. And during his time leading DA, Chris would start development of a game that he would become infamous for. Freelancer's development was started in 1997 and was spearheaded by Chris Roberts himself. It was intended to revolutionize the gaming world with a focus on immersion and a more dynamic, living space sandbox universe MMO. Ever heard of that before? Servers with 128 players in a persistent multiplayer universe, a dynamic economy, weather and environments, groundbreaking technology, and most importantly, freedom. You could become whatever you wished in this sandbox universe, and it would soon be at your fingertips. Right? No. Due to the sheer scope and vision of the game, DA soon found itself in severe financial troubles, eventually being so bad it had to be acquired and bailed out by Microsoft in December of 2000 to prevent bankruptcy. Freelancer was in development hell for 6 long years, but eventually came to release in 2003 with a drastically reduced scope, with it only becoming a single-player game, still being a critical success for players adoring and enjoying it to this day, but far from the vision that Chris Roberts had originally intended. After the acquisition, Chris decided to leave DA while still maintaining a position as a consultant on Freelancer. Famously, Microsoft and Chris had a severely strained relationship, particularly harming the ego of a visionary such as Chris, that he was forced from the role of a funded partner to that of an employee, or as it would come to, an exiting founder. Chris Roberts would leave to, quote, pursue other creative endeavors. But a more honest statement from him is probably this.
Fuck Microsoft!
During the development of Freelancer, Chris had founded Fever Pitch Studios in 2001, and during its 2-year lifespan, it only created one title, Conquest Frontier Wars, but most of the development had taken place at digital Anvil. Fever Pitch Studios was later acquired by Warthog Games in 2003 for $300,000, becoming Warthog Texas. After his departure from DA and the sale of Fever Pitch Studios, Roberts would decide to take a hiatus from games development, instead desiring to focus on film production, which can of course be considered a bit surprising after the sting of the failed Wing Commander film. Undaunted, Chris set out for Hollywood and the movie industry. Chris would found the film and television company Point of No Return Entertainment in 2001, with the aim to produce 12 films over 5 years and a TV series, with the main goal seeming to have been to produce a Wing Commander series. Roberts was provided with roughly $50 million in funding for the development of these films, but it ultimately came to naught and nothing was ever produced. I could not find what happened to these $50 million. Perhaps it could be assumed that this money went towards the later founding of his next project, Ascendant Pictures, in March of 2002. Chris would go on to produce such movies as The Punisher, Outlander, and surprisingly, Lord of War, 2 of which are guilty pleasure movies of mine and one that is considered a fantastic film. But alas, spending the 2000s making movies left Chris wanting, as he still wished to create universes and media that one could get lost in, a feeling that would only grow with time. And even though Chris loved to produce and create movies, the games industry still called to him. But before making his return to games, Chris would at this time partake in the ever-so-famous German tax loophole, which was a popular way to fund movies at the time, which is why Uwe Boll managed to create all of his masterpieces. And I know nothing about German tax law, so I'm going to utilize AI to explain it to me because I have no idea how German tax law works. The German film tax loophole, active until 2005, allowed high-earning German investors to write off 100% of their film investments against their income tax immediately. Used heavily by Hollywood, this allowed studios to produce films by shifting tax risks to German investors, who often utilized leverage to boost tax savings. Approximately 70% of the funds raised via this method went towards Hollywood films, with movies like Lord of the Rings and Mission Impossible 2 being standouts. But alas, eventually even the government caught on to the loophole and it was later closed in 2005 to 2006, which meant that the money printer and their money shop was closed for Chris & Co. One could say that this dubious way of funding isn't exactly the greatest reflection on those whom took part, but hey, free money is free money. As time passed, games technology, graphics, and capabilities steadily increased, with Roberts playing such games as Mass Effect where he could immerse himself in the world. This nagging sensation would eventually overcome him, and Bigfoot Entertainment would acquire Ascendant Pictures in 2010, with Chris departing. Picture this: you are a former video game industry maverick with decades of experience, but now you are a bit out of the loop. You want to create not just a game, but a living, breathing universe. To achieve that nagging dream that you've always pursued but never quite been able to reach out and grasp. So what do you do? And how do you do this? You of course start with the foundation. You start with the engine. But there are of course many engines on the market, so which one do you choose? Unreal? Unity? Source? Or maybe even the CryEngine? But why choose the CryEngine? Is that not an FPS engine designed to melt computers and look pretty? Well, yes, but hidden beneath it hides so much more. Here I must take the time to highly recommend £10.42's video on this matter in regards to engine choice. It is fantastic. I am not as well versed in the technicalities of games, especially the engines. This is where the wonderful £10 picks up the slack. Link to his video in the description below. But more on the choice of CryEngine from the man that practically sold the CryEngine to Chris Roberts, Sean Tracy.
Oh wow. It's sort of a long story, I guess. I was one of the very originals. Well, it was really interesting. Back in 2010, I think it was, Chris came into my office with Ortwin, and my office being the GDC CryEngine booth. And we started talking about how to do a space game on the CryEngine. And this was back in 2010. And a lot of people, and hell, a lot of people still even now are like, well, CryEngine can't do that. I don't know how you'd ever do such large environments, how you'd ever carry around so many ships, because, it was mostly FPS engine. But what a lot of people don't see is all the other games that are being made on it. And my job at Crytek, I was the U.S. business director, so I was actually doing all the licensing of the engine to all the companies using it. So guys like Turtle Rock for Evolve. I'm trying to think of the ones that have been all announced because I don't want to break some NDA from Crytek or anything. But there's been a bunch of CryEngine games since then. Arcade, that's a big MMO. So I already knew that there was lots of ways to actually get around this stuff. So Chris, being how he is. He wanted kind of some proof, basically. So we gave him the SDK. He started building up the Hornet. So that was the very first ship that he sort of built up. He implemented all these thrusters and things like this. And this was after our first little demo. Then we met up. I think it was about 6 months later, or it might even been an entire year later. And he came in with an implementation of his own ship, right? Flying around pretty much. He had asked us how to do a space environment, so showed him how to get rid of all the terrain, how you can just be flying around, things like this. So he came in, and we were super impressed with the fact that he did this himself, because I had dealt with so many different CEOs, even tech directors that wouldn't write a single line of code themselves, right? So they would come in, they would just have to take our word for it and then go from there. So he actually did work within the vehicle system. He was super happy with what he was seeing there, and just wanted to know how to go a little bit bigger with it. Now, I got pretty excited about this, and one of the ways that I moved up pretty quick within Crytek is that I can put together a prototype very, very quickly, as you saw with the Planet stuff. We just had the tech, but yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. So then what I did, I recruited a guy named Hannes Apfel, who now works for us as well. He's the cinematics director, as well as Paul Reindel. And we were all still at Crytek at the time. And what I had said to them was listen, we really want to close this license. This will be an amazing game to have on the CryEngine. So what we did was put together that very first crowdfunding video that you guys saw. So that video changed very little, but what we did was we put that prototype together and we delivered it to Chris as is.
Chris Roberts, his wife Sandy Gardner, and Ortwin Freyamuth, the alleged wizard,
And now for something completely different.
would found Cloud Imperium Games in April of 2012. Now we're going to take a brief look into the founders of CIG to get a bearing on the other individuals, not just Chris. Sandy Gardner is, as mentioned, the wife of Chris Roberts, which was unknown at the time as they didn't make this relationship clear.
That I signed on to this project because I truly believed in Chris's vision, and I really wanted to help him make this vision come true. Being his wife, as you all know, it's not a secret.
Thank you, Miss Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Which was a rather strange move, as she does have a master's in business and marketing. She initially interviewed for the role of VP of marketing, working as a consultant for CIG, before eventually deciding to come on as the VP of Marketing herself. Her relationship to Chris not being clear to the community being an odd choice was compounded by the fact that Aaron Roberts, his brother, and numerous friends from previous games they had worked on was never a big deal. So the unnecessary smoke and mirrors was the first of many unforced errors by CIG. Sandy is also featured in Squadron 42 as the character called Pusher, and works at CIG up until the current day. If you wish to know more about what she allegedly did before joining CIG, please do not read the Forbes article. Please. Ortwin Freymuth is likely to be a character in the history of Cloud Imperium games that the majority of the community have never heard of, because he is an alleged wizard that has cast spells upon the community to disguise himself. Ortwin, however, remains one of the key figures behind the founding of Cloud Imperium. He worked together with Chris in order to secure private investors to fund the project, but this endeavor proved difficult and worked together to develop and further the crowdfunding model instead. Ortwin would go on to become vice chair and general counsel, but stepping down from these roles in 2023 and 2024. But as far as I've been able to discern, still remains a member of the board of Cloud Imperium Games UK Limited. But now, as we are introduced to all of the characters in the beginning of this story, it is time for Ortwin, Sandy, and Chris to finally see if their desire to move towards a crowdfunded model will prove fruitful, at the Game Developers Conference online in Austin, Texas. Finally, Chris decided to make his ridiculously triumphant return into gaming, leveraging the capital of player love that he had earned through the years with the classics of Wing Commander and Freelancer. The work that Chris, Sean, and others had put towards creating these assets for just about a year would later lead to this, at the time, rather stunning first display of the Bengal carrier, marking the first entry of Star Citizen and Squadron 42 into the world. And here I shall give you a short snippet of the resulting work. Interestingly, however, the first game on display was not Star Citizen, but Squadron 42. And as he speaks, we can clearly tell how intertwined these games have always been. That one is supposed to complement the other in one holistic experience within the same universe.
So what am I going to build? So I'm going to build a universe, and the sort of name of the universe, or the community I'm talking about is going to be called Star Citizen. In this universe, for instance, you can sign up for your military duty, which is one of the ways to earn citizenship, and that, in essence, is playing the single-player story narrative campaign that's the Wing Commander experience, and that's the typical branching mission setup that you would have in Wing Commander. Is that particular experience we're calling Squadron 42, which was sort of what that cinematic trailer was about, and the 42nd Squadron of the Imperial Navy in this universe is sort of a legendary fighting unit. It's very much like the French Foreign Legion. In fact, that it's always in the toughest areas, trying to hold back the sort of alien hordes that are threatening humanity, and they, somehow manage to pull out in, against all the odds. And to actually be accepted into this squadron is a pretty huge deal, and sort of gives you a sort of certain level of status. It'd be like being a Navy SEAL or something. So the goal of the narrative campaign is that you fight the battles very much in a sort of Wing Commander 1, Wing Commander 2 narrative branching style, and then if you manage to succeed at the end, you'll be invited into the squadron, and then when you finish that, you'll be able to muster out, you'll have some credits in your pocket, and you'll sort of have the status of being an ex-member of the 42nd Squadron, and there's a sort of community of sort of ex-members in the universe, and then you go out and make your fortune in the universe, and we'll do another story campaign in a little bit, just much like the Wing Commander mission packs, and you could always re-up for another tour of duty. And then, so you have that, which is sort of the Wing Commander experience, and then you have sort of the Privateer Freelancer experience, which is...
There have been numerous controversies over the years with the false assumption that only one of the games were pitched. Features and scope has been altered, but not the fact that there'd be two separate experiences or two separate games. It is also important to note that as development went on, this did become a bit more muddled as to what was going on throughout the game's development. But as we can see here, the vision Chris Roberts has had since the days of Wing Commander and Freelancer is something that he very much still desired to accomplish, even decades later. The scope may have changed with features being removed or altered, but the core vision inside of Chris Roberts' head is still very much the case. Which is something I've heard confirmed from several sources, from the fan base and even some friends that have had face-to-face meetings with Chris Roberts. A source which must sadly remain anonymous.
Part of what I'm trying to do here is, one, I'm coming back to make a game. I'm very focused on making it about PC. I feel like the games that I made in the past were obviously, at the heart, they were always PC games. I felt like, one of the things that Wing Commander and the other games I made was all about sort of pushing what you could do on the PC and sort of showing sort of the aspiration and the dream of it all. And I felt like over the last few years, especially as a player, I kind of feel like as a PC gamer, I'm kind of, underserved. I can either play ports of a console game. So, I have a console.
Another important character in the story of Squadron 42 is of course the person responsible for writing its story. This man would make an entrance in 2012, Dave Haddock, who would meet Chris Roberts during this year, and Haddock would later go on to become the lead writer and narrative director of Squadron 42. Writing lore, dialogue, and characters, Haddock would become one of the founding members of Cloud Imperium Games and has been attached to the project since. He even goes on to have his very own cameo in Star Citizen that we will see later during the course of this documentary or retrospective, whatever you want to call it. And with the unveiling of the Star Citizen and Squadron 42 project roaring to life, the mass influx of money and attention was so great that it ultimately crashed the website.
Apparently, our site is having millions of hits and is overloaded, so everyone out there, please be patient.
I think this is a little harder than I first thought.
This heavy influx of potential backers led to a partnership with Kickstarter in order to manage the sheer number of people that wished to donate or pledge to the project. The Kickstarter was of course a massive success, as crowds or even hordes of potential backers rallied to the website to pledge or donate. And here on the Kickstarter we can clearly see that Squadron 42 is proudly mentioned as a spiritual successor to the legacy of the Wing Commander series. So to reiterate, Squadron 42 is the single-player element and the game in the Star Citizen universe and was always planned alongside its sister game, which is the MMO component.
At ease, pilots. It's been a difficult campaign, but we're winning this thing, thanks to your efforts. Stretch goals are on the run, and it won't be much longer. We have 2 big targets left. 6,000 clicks out. Alpha Wing, I'll be needing you to hit Kickstarter. Beta Wing, you'll be swarming the RSI pledge site. We need all of you. Tell your family. Tell your friends. Tell your pets if that's what it takes. Offer them upgrades, extra ships, whole new tiers, whatever gets us over the top. We have 1 week left. If we can defeat these 2, then the war is won. We lost a lot of good web designers and artists getting this far. Don't let that be in vain. So man your ships, and let's teach these stretch goals what it means to mess with Squadron 42. For the Empire, for the PC, for the space sim.
At the end of the crowdfunding campaign on November 19th, 2012, Star Citizen and Squadron 42 had raised an astonishing, for the time, $6.2 million in crowdfunding, with $2.1 million being raised on the Kickstarter and $4.1 million being raised on the RSI website. With this new funding in their back pockets, the future looked bright for the space sim community and Cloud Imperium Games, as they proudly headed towards the next year. And with only 2 years until release, what could go wrong? Towards the end of 2012, but mostly in 2013, it is also important to mention that during the course of Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, there would be several behind-the-scenes shows. The first one of these shows would be pioneered and spearheaded by Eric Wingman Peterson, who created the series called Wingman's Hangar.
The show's beginning, how it started. I mean, initially, we did a live stream, Chris, myself, Sandy, Martin, and some others, and Dave Swafford, and we're doing the 24-hour live stream in a friend of ours' office to launch this thing, and I got kind of bored with just being in there with the group and listening to people talk, and so I was like, well, I'm just gonna go out and start my own channel. So I went out and grabbed a Ustream channel and started doing chair races and how quick I could go and touch Chris in the ear and run back, and the fans were actually timing the times and stuff. And so
some other people were getting into that too. Sandy was jumping in.
Yeah, she was doing this parrot thing, or they started calling her my parrot on my shoulder. So she would come out there. It was just kind of fun. And then we went to dinner and had a few libations and it got a little wild. We had Angry Billy on there for a while. So anyway, that's kind of how how it started. Chris saw that and saw the reaction of people and said, remember he said, you guys should do a weekly hour show. And I was like,
with Eric, we'd get to take a peek behind the curtain of the day-to-day at CIG and be given information in a rather casual and fun format. This, of course, helped to sell CIG's open development style, and it would be met positively by fans. It is important to mention this, as you will see certain figures appear then disappear, and this will be stated clearly whenever the beginning of a new show begins to avoid confusion. In 2013, a man known very well by the Wing Commander fan community, Ben Loaf, yes really, Lesnick, would become one of CIG's first employees in 2013. And his impact on the games, especially in their early years, was instrumental in the success of the crowdfunding campaign. Ben had corresponded with Chris Roberts since the 90s, and the contact had only increased over the years, as Ben was running the largest Wing Commander fan website, Wing Commander Combat Information Center, a mouthful to be sure. He would come up with the concept sales of ships, getting into the nitty-gritty details of each ship so that players could fall in love with them. He helped Chris Roberts and, per extension, Cloud Imperium Games to understand how the fan community around him worked.
We kind of corresponded ever since. Whenever he would have wanted to bring back Space Sims or Wing Commander, there's going to be a Wing Commander TV show, there's going to be a GameCube game, there's a lot of these ideas. I would always come back and he would ask me for what the community is thinking.
And he thusly became Director of Community Engagement and Content Strategy, as well as Master of Ships.
It's nice because there's still, as big as we are, there's still that small company feel. I mean, I think you could go in, if you had some great idea or were worried about something, you could go and talk to Chris Roberts just like I could. And he would listen to you as well. So it's
And it could be said in one way that without him, the longevity of the project would have been uncertain without his insight and willingness to engage with the community, which he still does to this very day. As seen previously during the course of the reveal trailer for Squadron 42 and Star Citizen, the Vandal would become the main antagonist species for the Star Citizen universe. More species would of course also be added, like the Tavarin, Banu, Xi'an, and the Cathag. But for the purposes of Squadron 42, the as stated antagonist species would become the Vandal. As Squadron wears its legacy on its sleeve, it's not surprising to find out that the Vandal takes some inspiration, perhaps not in terms of appearance, but behaviorally, from the Kilrathi. The Kilrathi are of course the antagonist species of the Wing Commander universe. But the difference would be, instead of a great empire, the Vandal would instead take the form of migrating clans, seemingly only made up exclusively by males, which could indicate the female Vandal are hidden somewhere deep within Vandal space. Who knows of what wondrous mysteries we shall solve during the course of the games. The original intention, as stated by Chris Roberts, is that Squadron 42 would serve as a tutorial for the player to earn their wings by training and fighting in the single-player campaign. You would enroll in the United Empire of Earth's Navy as a civilian, then serve during your tour of duty and eventually leave the military as a full citizen. which would carry over into Star Citizen. It appears the intention was that all of this would take place within the same game at the time, with separate menu options to enter the persistent universe or the single-player campaign. Though it is important to note that they'd still share assets and run on the same engine, so separate but the same. Kind of. It was also intended to feature a co-op mode, but that has since appeared to have been completely scrapped, with the smaller campaign of earning your wings being supplanted by a far grander triple or quadruple A experience. This all-new cinematic and narrative experience would only expand further as the scope of both Star Citizen and Squadron 42 changed, due to the technologies they were developing and the new possibilities the large amount of funding they had secured enabled. These new technologies and further developments to the game's engines would later enable them to move on from the previous loading screens and landing zones to wholly simulated planets with seamless transitions from space, atmosphere to surface, which we will cover more later. It is also important to mention the community polls, but they will also be covered a little bit later, but also what occurred as a result of the increase in funding. At the time, the amount of funding pouring in became a bit of a feedback loop, meaning that as more money came in, the more stuff would be added to the game. People kept giving them more money, which meant more stuff would be put in the game and so on. So the question is, when would this stop? Cloud Imperium games would undergo fast expansion as crowdfunding money kept pouring in. Chris Roberts would leverage his industry connections to work together with a previous colleague and his company called Void Alpha, but this would not be the only company that CIG hired to outsource development to. Cloud Imperium would also find itself working with Armory, Behavior Interactive, and probably the most important company, Turbulent, which would go on to be instrumental in the story of Star Citizen and Squadron 42 due to their work on the RSI website. Turbulent would also go on to later be acquired by CIG in July of 2023. But there was a final company that they outsourced development to, namely CGBot in Mexico, which will briefly become perhaps not important, but a little bit funny later. 2013 would also breathe new life into the project with a not perhaps new concept, but a brilliant one. The Citizencon, an event where the developers could come on stage alongside Chris Roberts himself to discuss the status and future plans for the game live whilst interacting with the community. At the tail end of Citizencon in 2013, it would finally be revealed that Cloud Imperium Games Manchester had started its formation, and it would of course be headed by none other than Aaron Roberts, being joined by several former colleagues across several games, adding to Cloud Imperium's experience and perhaps camaraderie. Cloud Imperium Manchester would also come to be known as Foundry 42 due to its main focus being on Squadron 42. I will not play the live audio at its original volume for, put frankly, the cringe levels reached dangerous levels during this segment.
Mission Control, do you read me? Mission Control, do you read me? This is Commander Roberts. Station Command, Boundary 42. Come in.
This is Mission Control. Receiving you, Commander.
The Eagle has landed. The Eagle has landed. Strike Recon Team is online.
Acknowledged, Commander. Transmit identification data now.
Transmitting now.
Confirmed, Commander. Personnel validated. Strike team assembled. Mission is a go. I repeat, mission is a go. Execute Executive Order Squadron 42. Good hunting, Commander.
Thanks, Control. Good to be back.
One can, however, surmise that this is how the Roberts brothers used to play together when growing up. In spite of the rambunctious cringe that was witnessed during the course of the first Citizencon, or the technical difficulties and the violence.
Did you hear that? Are you insane? Stop attacking! Stop! Oh dear! I seem to be wounded, but I can keep going.
The event overflowed with nerd enthusiasm. It was made quite clear to the community that these developers loved what they were doing, and they were more than happy to share an insight to their work. Citizencon was ultimately a very successful event to celebrate the development of both Star Citizen and Squadron 42, a tradition that continues to this day. And with the success of Citizencon, the size of the community and funding would only continue to grow.
You've got mail.
Letters from the Chairman was a concept introduced by CIG where Chris Roberts would write the eponymous letters upon having reached the next million in funding on the stretch goal counter, which the project would of course become infamous for. This hype train allowed them to smash ceiling after ceiling, but due to the shifting nature of the game, plenty of these stretch goals would find themselves falling on the wayside. In November of 2013, a letter from the Chairman was posted on the 22nd of November, celebrating the 29th million mark having been reached in the game's funding. This level of funding enabled them to further increase the scope of Squadron 42, by instead of merely opening with a linear training mission, it would instead start with an epic space battle. This, of course, being the first ever mention of the prologue space battle we'd come to see in later years during leaks, trailers, and eventually a live gameplay reveal. Hark, gentlemen, we have finally arrived at the first delivery date of Star Citizen and Squadron 42, 2014. But of course, due to the increased crowdfunding and the shifting scope of the game as a result, it was delayed, which was entirely expected by the community. But hey, it's only a year away. 2014 would mark the end of Wingman's hangar, which also included the departure of the wingman himself, Eric Wingman Peterson. He stepped down because he didn't want to move from Texas to California, which is perfectly understandable, as at the time CIG was consolidating leadership at their Santa Monica studio to reduce Chris's travel between studios. But yes, it was the end of the Wingman's tenure, and in its stead a new show would arise instead, Around the Verse, which would be hosted by Sandy Gardner and Ben Lesnick instead, following the same sort of format as Wingman's with a somewhat higher production quality. Sandy was, of course, a choice because she wasn't exactly too popular at the time either, due to making such public statements as this.
I'm always very mindful of the community. For example, I flew to Manchester. I got this super cheap ticket to Manchester. And Chris was like, why didn't you fly business? And I said, well, I don't know. I saw this $900 ticket and I thought, well, I'll just fly economy because I don't want the fans thinking. And he's like, well, fans don't even know. He goes, you gotta like be comfortable. I said, yeah, but you know, I think...
I find it important to add after playing that clip that this reflects worse on Chris more so than it does on Sandy, but this is how she chose to completely willingly, during an interview, express herself. Oh dear. But now I find it a good time to discuss the video concept that would cause much more joy and dissatisfaction in the community. The concept was simple. As a part of Wingman's hangar, every week Chris would answer 10 questions sent in by the community. This would allow Chris to more easily speak to the community in bite-sized videos, so the community would not have to wait until a Citizencon, Gamescom, or PAX event, or letter from the chairman for him to speak. But this would also cause a significant amount of problems for CIG, for you see, Chris Roberts is a visionary, and he has a very wild imagination. This would mean he would give very broad and in-depth answers to the questions the community had posed, giving confidence that many of these things that they wanted to see in the game would happen, only to then find out that in many cases it is the intention, but no work has actually gone towards this feature or content, and it's merely Chris speculating and dreaming what he'd also like to see.
So next question comes from Valarian, who asks, will you be able to hail NPC ships and threaten them to drop their cargo on the off chance it will save their ship? If so, will there be a randomly generated personality for NPCs, some that fight, flee to the nearest authority, or cows that will drop their cargo and run? Yeah, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, my goal actually is for the NPCs in the game to sort of feel and appear much like real people. So in some ways, I almost sort of feel like until you get up close, I kind of don't want the players to really even know that it's an NPC or a player. It could be an NPC or it could be a player. And therefore, the NPCs are already designing a bunch of behavior for them, and part of their plan is to sort of have sort of kind of human-like responses, like preserve their own life or do all that kind of stuff. So I would definitely say that you will be able to say, give us your cargo, or pay the consequences. And some people will fight you, and some people will just surrender the cargo and get out of there.
This series should instead have been named 10 Unforced Errors, and it would eventually lead to the end of 10 for the chairman, as Chris's answers caused more issues than it brought confidence to the community. It would also cause issues from outsiders looking in, which would only exacerbate the accusations of vaporware, fraud, and scam.
Okay, so Bess asks, is the plan to release Squadron 42 and the Persistent Universe at the same time, or will one come out before the other? Good question. I mean, from our standpoint, I think we want to give you Squadron 42, or at least part of it, before the Persistent Universe is finished, so to speak. And we're kind of toying around with how we can do this with Squadron 42 in a way that sort of falls into the methodology we're using and sort of development methodology, because I think giving you the whole Squadron 42 is just an alpha may not work as well, because it's a story, so it needs to be fairly polished as far as that goes. So one of our thoughts is to take Squadron 42 and sort of release it episodically. So before the game is fully finished, where you play the first X number of missions that are nice and well done and polished, and then the next X number of missions a month later, and so on until you've worked your way through Squadron 42, which would lead you up to the sort of beta of the Persistent Universe. So that's currently our thinking. It's still in process right now, but we'll see. But when the game is finished properly, obviously Squadron 42 and Persistent Universe, Star Citizen would all be sort of in as part of the package. Okay, that's it. That's the last of our 10 questions and our first 10 from the chairman. So thanks for sitting with me. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
So even though it was, in a way, a loss for the players, it was ultimately the right choice for everyone's sanity and the longevity of the games. 10 for the Chairman had a decent run, with a total of 88 episodes from December 2013 until a final episode on March 15, 2017. The show would not be replaced by anything Chris-related. Chris would allege, however, that he believed the series had gotten stale and that he wanted to do something fresh. Now gagged, Chris would mostly thereon only be speaking at events such as Gamescom or Citizencon, and this is the state he's been left in since. 2013 and 2014 would also be the years of a few landmark choices that were put in the hands of the community, which consequences echo until this very day. It was of course intended for Squadron 42 and Star Citizen to be delivered in 2014, but as the funding kept increasing, it meant that the scope could also increase, offering the players more features and content that they'd eventually be able to enjoy. As Chris Roberts stated in 2013, his dream was to make the best damn space sim. So in 2013, a vote was held if they should keep the crowdfunding counter going after they reached their goal. 87% of the backers taking part in the vote voted yes. 2014 would also have its own highly controversial vote with the question, should we continue to offer stretch goals, which under the accusations of scope creep would only have 57% of backers that voting yes. According to this post found on the Refundian Reddit, a not always charitable page towards CIG or Star Citizen, it is still highly relevant with the numbers it comes included with. For what could likely be considered the biggest part of the controversy is the number of backers that actually were aware of this vote. For the 2013 vote, according to the post, there were only 21,076 votes cast, with a grand total of 179,000 alpha backers. That is only 8% of backers, and with 88% voting yes, however, it was a landslide victory. The vote in 2014 was even more controversial when the community was asked again if they should continue to offer stretch goals, with only 55% voting yes, with only 34,590 alpha backers voting, meaning only 14% of paying backers actually voted. So yes, the community did vote to continue to increase the scope. So the community takes part of the blame that Squadron 42's and Star Citizen scope kept increasing. At the same time, however, CIG would assure that this could all be done within a reasonable time frame, as in Chris Roberts' own words, they kept accelerating. But it is also fair at the same time to point out that, sure, the community did vote to increase the scope, but due to the tiny portion of people that actually voted, it could be argued that it was only the absolute diehards that got the chance to vote. The people that backed, forgot about it, and were waiting for the previous version of the games they were promised weren't perhaps properly informed about this. So at that point, it is almost a given that of course, the fans would want more game for their money. But this would of course come with unforeseen consequences later on. If any country only had a turnout of 14% for a vote, it'd be considered farcical. But now we arrive at Citizencon 2014. Mic issues appear to be something that had haunted CIG in their early years, as they struggled to maintain consistent audio quality and due to a high-pitched noise in the background.
We've done Arena Commander, we've done Broken Moon,
making it hard to play some of these very important clips. But they are important and thusly they must be played. So, sorry for your ears if it, hurts. 2014 would also mark our first introduction to one of the early versions of the Archon station, which we'd see improved upon over the years. But this clip offers the most comprehensive early viewing of the size and scale of the station.
What we've accomplished this year, I'm personally most proud of getting levels out to you guys. I mean, these levels are so big. So what we're showing now is Shubin's facility called Archon. Now Shubin Interstellar is a corporation, a mining corporation. The facility that you can see is the Archon. Now this thing is big, like 6 kilometers big. And currently it's in its grey box phase. So you're seeing full mesh detail, no textures or shaders. Just the physical act of making these levels was initially so hard because the CryEngine was custom built for small environments. And we had to render big space scenes. That's a big achievement.
According to Aaron Roberts, as you can hear during this clip, the intention was to release the game in 2015.
Going forward, loads to do. The big one for us is Squadron 42. We're looking to have the vertical slice working for the end of this year, and then of course next year we plan to release the first chapter of Squadron 42 for you guys.
It appears that what they mean by chapter is not the game's first mission, but the first game in the Squadron 42 series. So at this time, the intended release very much appears to have been 2015. But that would of course change quite quickly. But even as late as November 3rd, 2014, Chris Roberts would reiterate a 2015 release date at PAX Australia's fan event. This fan event would even feature a rare Chris Roberts F-bomb. We truly live in the greatest timeline. This was merely included for a short bit of fun.
I'm pretty sure I killed you since I put a bunch of missiles into you.
He's bulletproof.
To those asking in the stream, Chris is flying the Avenger.
Yeah, it's the unbalanced Avenger too.
He is a gamer. Handsome Roberts wins again.
And then we get some drinks, and I'll be there and sign things, and okay.
I just know that we're going to do every single thing possible to me.
I'll bet this day at late night's just polishing it, huh?
Which is obviously why it's going to take a little longer than we originally thought, but I think...
Sit back in your seats. This is going to be a hell of a ride. Take care.
I hope you've enjoyed everything you've seen in these last 2 days.
I found it hard to say admirable Bishop. See, I can't do it.
If you asked me when I started this, if you'd be talking to me 14 years later, still not finished, and but everyone, it's going stronger than ever, and there's more and more people than ever that are playing it and supporting it, and I would have probably thought you were crazy.
Attention, fleet! This is Admiral... Sorry, I'm not used to acting. Attention, fleet! This is Admiral... Attention, fleet! This is Bishop. You are ordered to immediately withdraw.
Who the hell are you?
So we got about 4 hours on the live stream. We're gonna show you some stuff, talk about some stuff. Here we go. You guys out here who are beautiful, wonderful, early adopters, willing to put up with bugs, jankiness, not a great new player experience. We know all those things are things that we want to fix and improve, and we want a game that everyone can just get into at the beginning, understand it, have fun, pulls you into it, and then has a huge amount